Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Hebrews 6. Hebrews is in the New Testament. If you're still learning your way around the Bible, notice that there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. And the Old Testament begins with Genesis, and the New Testament begins with Matthew. You say, why two testaments? Well, in its simplest form, that the Old Testament is before the birth of Jesus, and the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus on. There's a lot more to it than that, but we'll just start there. And so Hebrews, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, keep going, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, keep going, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, keep going, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews. It's right before the book of James. We're talking about patience. Everybody say patience. And I said this last week and I'll say it again today. It's hard to say it with a smile on your face. There's nothing fun about patience. When I began to prepare for this, I saw that patience comes from a Latin word which means suffering. Suffering. How many of you have suffered in patience before? All right. Well, and so last week we talked about being patient in difficult places. Next week we're going to talk about being patient with difficult people. Look at the person next to you. I think he's talking about you. All right. So yeah, some of you are scared. Anyway, and so then the week after that, we're going to talk about God's patience with us. Today we're going to talk about patience for the things that God has promised. I know that there's some of you in here that at some point in your life that God has spoken to your heart about something, or you've been praying about something, and you just had this, when you first started praying, there was this excitement, this anticipation, this expectation that God was going to do something in this area of your life. And so you were so excited, but as time went on, you began to kind of falter. You began to, your anticipation began to wane a little bit, and then discouragement set in and all those things. And so we're going to talk about the role that patience plays while we're waiting on God to show up. Now, and again, that's not a literal term, that's a figurative term, because He's always here. He's always with you. He hasn't, if you're a Christian, He never leaves or forsakes you. And so, He's with you, but there are just times in my own life, man, I felt like at times that God was my roommate, and there are other times I felt like He was on a missions trip in China. Anybody else felt that way before? It's like, man, I'll be glad when He gets back from China. I could sure use Him in Claremore, Oklahoma today. And so I've had that feeling before too. And so, while we're waiting on whatever it is for this breakthrough, for this change in our life, for the next phase of our life, for the ministry that He's called us to, for the job that we believe is ours, for all those things, what takes place there? And so in Hebrews 6, verse 11, it says this. He said, our great desire is that you'll keep on loving others as long as life lasts. So he started out with, he said, look, the desire for us as believers, that as long as we're here, we'll keep on loving each other. But then he goes on to say, in order to make certain that what you hope for will come true, then you will not become spiritually dull. Everybody say dull. And indifferent. Yeah, and indifferent. Instead, you'll follow the example of those who are going to inherit God's promises because of their faith and endurance. Another word for that word endurance is patience. Because of their faith and endurance. In other words, if they inherited God's promises because of their faith and endurance. In other words, they were willing to endure for a period of time, waiting on things to happen. And some people say, well, this is only talking about when we go to heaven. Well, that is an element of it because they were under a tremendous amount of persecution that we want to stay steady because this life is short compared to eternity. But the example that they give following this indicates that it's not just for that. Here's the example they give in the next verse. He said, for example, there was God's promise to Abraham. Since there was no one greater to swear by, God took an oath in His own name, saying, I will certainly bless you, and I will multiply your descendants beyond number. Then Abraham waited patiently. Patiently. He had no kids. Him and his wife Sarah had no kids. He was 75, she was 65, and God said, you guys, you're going to be the father of many nations. I'm going to bless you exceedingly in this area. Now, I'm not 75 yet, and would love to live to be that age, but when that time comes, if He said to me, hey, I know you and Tina thought you guys were through having kids, but you're going to have another child, I would ask Him to take me home. But the other thing is grandkids are just so much more fun. Anyway, so the thing I would do is that I would think, okay, well, probably in the next year we're going to have a baby. And for him, he may have thought that, like we're going to have a child. And it was 25 years later. 25 years later. So he had to be patient, waiting on the reality of what God had spoken to him in his life. And so maybe it's where you are right now, is that you're having to be patient, and there's just this anxiety, this frustration even at times. And then he even said this, that he talked about that he didn't want us to become dull or indifferent. And this is what I've seen happen sometimes, is that people begin to pray about things, and they have an excitement, and they're waiting, they're seeing God, it's just God's doing some things in their life, and He's spoken some things to them, and it feels like it's taken so long that as time goes on, they begin to get discouraged, and they begin to be less focused on their walk with God, and then eventually they become indifferent. It's like almost like they forgot, or just thought, I guess it's not going to happen, or if it does happen, who knows. And so that excitement, that anticipation that was such a huge part of just keeping our walk fresh, causing us to seek God, causing us to press into His presence, that all those things, that as time goes on, if we're not careful, if patience isn't a part of our walk while we're waiting on God to reveal for whatever He's spoken into our lives to become a reality in our life, it just over time can become so easy to get discouraged. So he said that through faith and patience, one of the things that should be a part of our walk with God is a daily expectation that He wants to do something in our life. If you've made Jesus Lord of your life, it's just this ongoing thing that God wants to do in your world. When's the last time you were excited about what God has spoken to your heart? And if it's been a while, is it because somewhere along the line when the last time He spoke to you, it's just taken so long that discouragement has set in? That you've kind of become dull and indifferent in your walk? And Jesus, who was so much a part of your daily world, of your daily walk, that now it's not like you've given up on Him, it's not like you've walked away from Him, but He's just a part of your world. He's not your world. I think sometimes it's because along that line that He spoke to our heart and we embraced it by faith, but as time went on, that we didn't take patience with us. And so number one is that patience keeps us from becoming indifferent. Notice it says through faith and endurance, or faith and patience, that those things travel together. Sometimes people will get discouraged and say, "Man, you just need to have more. You just need to have faith." Well, maybe. But maybe they got faith. Maybe what they need is some patience. This expectation that I'll wait as long as it takes because God is faithful. Because He can be trusted. I can trust Him more than I can trust the calendar. I feel like in my own life, in my own world, that almost everything has taken place later for me than it did for a lot of my friends. I was almost 28 when I got married. And then it took somebody that long for you to convince them? Yes, it did. So and then almost it was around 30 when I had our first child, and then we started a church when I'm in my mid 40s. Just longer than people usually do those things, and there's just this part of me, my flesh almost became kind of panicky, like this really needs to happen. This really needs to happen, and yet God is more faithful than the calendar. He's more faithful than those kind of things. And again, you may look at your life and you may say, you know what, I'm just not as excited about the things of God. I'm just not as excited about my walk with God as I once was. And there could be several reasons why, but maybe for you, it's because somewhere along the line is that one time you were excited about the things that God had spoken to your heart and you couldn't wait for those things to get here. And as time went on, because patience wasn't part of your traveling companion with faith, that it just began to just leave you. And so now, if I were to say, what are you confidently excited about what God is doing in your life and wants to do in your life in days to come? What are you just so lit up about that it keeps pushing you into the presence of God? The truth of the matter is that some of us are just better with just challenges in front of us. Without those things, we don't spend time with God. But for each one of us, that because God loves each one of us, that He has a plan for our life and He wants to speak into our world right now, But today is not the only day He has for you. That there's things that He has yet that He wants to do for you. And so He wants us to be pulled into His presence. And as we get there and He begins to speak things to our heart, and some of them will seem so much bigger than where we are or who we are or the resources that we have, that we know that the only way it can happen is if God does it. And then if He doesn't do it quickly enough, then as time goes along, we begin to be discouraged. And that discouragement begins to make us dull in our relationship with Him, and we begin to get distracted. Anybody ever been there besides me? So number one is this: is patience is so important because it keeps us from becoming indifferent. Indifferent in our walk with God. Look at number two, if you would. Go with me to Hebrews 10:36. Actually, 10:34. You're right there in Hebrews 6, so just a few chapters over. Hebrews 10, verse 34. And again, to understand part of the theme of Hebrews is that there were a lot of Jewish Christians a lot of Jews that were becoming Christians, and they were facing a lot of persecution. So a lot of this is written to them to just encourage them to keep going, not to give up or anything like that. So in Hebrews 10:34, he said, "You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail. And when all you owned was taken from you, you accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord." So don't throw away your confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you. In other words, don't quit trusting God. Don't just throw it away. Hang on to it, because as you hang on to it, that it's bringing a great reward from your obedience for the things He's promised you. Remember the great reward it brings you. Patient endurance is what you need now. So again, if you're here this morning and you're like, man, it's been a while since I've been excited about something that God wants to do in my life. Or, Pastor Rick, man, I'm still kind of excited, but it's like drifting from me. It's leaking out of my life, and I don't, discouragement's trying to set in. Well, don't throw away your confidence. Don't cast it away. And patient endurance is what you need now. Why? So that you will continue. Everybody say continue. So that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that He has promised. So what happens is God begins to speak to us, and He begins to lead us. I know in my own life that when I was younger and I was working at a large ministry and I was in the shipping department, and yet on the inside of me, in my heart, many of you have heard my story before, that there was just this dissatisfaction that I had a desire to minister to students. And so time would go on, and it just kept building. And eventually I was like, I began to set aside my lunch hour. We had this little room at this ministry, and so I'd bring a sandwich, I'd eat it, and I would just sit there and open up my Bible to Jeremiah 33:3, which says, "Call unto me, and I will answer you and show you great and mighty things which you know not." And I spent that lunch hour just praying and seeking God, and even saying to the Lord, "Lord, if this isn't of you, then you got to take this out of me, because right now I'm so dissatisfied. And it's not fair to the people I'm working for. They're good to me. I'm getting money from them, so they deserve me to be committed here. And so either reveal this to me," and just still every day, because part of it was like, how's this going to happen? I don't know how this is going to happen. I can't make this happen. And so just every day, just that thing in there, and it just created this tension and this conflict on the inside of me. And sometimes there was just this thought of just let it go. Just let it go. And this other part was like, but I can't. I've tried turning it off, and I just can't turn it off. Well, that thing in me just made me begin to do things that would just prepare me. In other words, read stuff, serve in certain areas. That it was just one of those things that would happen. And I think about this so many times, is that in our life that we think about the rewards, we think about the things that we want. And I'm a sports guy. I mean, this one of my, the song, "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year." You guys sing that about Christmas. I sing it about football. And so, it's just one of those things. So I want to show you a picture here. And this is the picture of the BCS trophy. In other words, at the end of the year, they'll give one of the major college teams this trophy. I want to give some of my bodybuilding trophies up there, but we'd have a big enough picture. So anyway, that's a joke. Anyway, so we knew. So And so right here, one thing I like is that many times when a football game is going on, they'll show this picture at different games that are going, and just reminding people that at the end of the year, somebody's going to get this. They're going to be rewarded for their willingness to endure, the willingness to stay with it. And this is what I've discovered about all of our lives, is that all of us love the trophies. We don't like the trials. But the reality of it is that there are no trophies without a willingness to endure the trials. And so we need patience as we endure those things, because if we don't, sometimes it's real easy to get distracted, to stop doing the things that we know to do. And don't misunderstand me, the things that God does for us, none of it is based upon works. It is the grace of God. In other words, it's not because we deserve it. And yet, on the other hand, there still is this preparation, this thing that we have to do, this kind of keeps stepping forward. You know, one of the words we use a lot of times is the word grind. And in our culture today, just with so much seemingly instantaneous success, the grind has kind of been set on the shelf. But to do it right, to get it's just God does it this way. He does it this way. You know, if I see a pizza in a box, it's like, preheat the oven to 350 and heat it up, and then for the next 25 minutes. We look at life that way and we say, well, I'm going to put it on 700 and cook it for 12. Don't try that. It's just not the same. It's just not ready like it's supposed to be. And the same thing's true with you and I. That there's this work that God does in us, and so patience causes us, when it still seems like that everything that God has spoken to us is nowhere in sight, that if we remain confident in the faithfulness of God, then it causes us to continue moving forward. And on those days where we're like, I'm not going to serve anymore, I'm not going to pray anymore, I'm not going to seek God anymore, I'm just so disappointed, so discouraged, and so frustrated. Don't cast away your confidence. There's a great reward in staying true and staying faithful. It takes you to where you need to be. It gets us there. Sometimes we can become so dull and indifferent with what we want to do and what we want to see. And so the word, we said that the word patience comes from the word to suffer. The word patience in the Greek here means to stay or remain. To stay underneath, to remain there. I remember I saw this one individual. They really wanted to be in full-time ministry so badly, and they'd applied for a job at a church, and just just thought that they should be the one that gets it. And when it didn't happen, they got offended and ended up leaving the church. And I knew some things behind the scenes, and what they didn't know is that even though that they weren't going to get that job, that there was conversation about some other jobs that were getting ready to open up at the church that they were going to be approached by and say, would you like to do this? But because they couldn't see what was going to happen and where it was going to be, then they let this offense set in. And it didn't bring them closer to what they wanted. It took them further away. If you've been praying about some things and God has spoken some things into your heart, and you're in a real discouraging season right now, just remind yourself of why you began to believe God for this in the first place. And know that faith doesn't travel well by itself. It needs patience, because patience helps it endure. And when patience is part of its traveling companion, then it helps us to continue to do the things that we know to do, even if it feels like that nobody else notices. Nobody else is watching. I remember being at that ministry, going through those times, and I was giving my time there, and I was staying later, and a lot of times they didn't have it in the budget for overtime, but they needed the work, so I volunteered my time, and I would see people around me that showed up a minute before they were supposed to be there, and as soon as it was time to go home, they clocked out and went home. And I watched them get promoted. Man, in my mind, I was like, this is so unfair. And I even struggled with sometimes with almost getting bitter or angry about it. But then I'd have to go into that prayer room again, and God would have to remind me that my future was not theirs. It was in His hands. And it wasn't a question of, can I trust them? It was a question of, can I trust Him? If that's you, if you're like on the verge of like, man, I'm just so frustrated. I'm just so frustrated, and maybe you just see your walk with God is not as passionate as it used to be. I want to encourage you just to begin to talk to Him again about His plans for you, about the things in your world that matter, about your family, about your job, about your education, about where He wants you to serve, about the gifts that you have. To begin to reveal and understand again, to be reminded of your purpose. One of the reasons we do Growth Track is because it gives people an opportunity to have that stirred up in them again. Do a gifts test to find out, okay, these are the things that I'm just inclined to do. It's just so easy in the middle of that discouragement to just kind of step away and head another direction. But He said this, patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you'll receive all that He has promised. Don't quit trusting God. And understand this, that discouragement is a big weapon of the enemy. It is a big weapon of the enemy. He wants to discourage us and get us distracted and just kind of take things in their own hands or to give up. So if you're dealing with discouragement right now, just know this, you're probably on the right track. Because otherwise, why would the enemy try to use discouragement to get you off of the way you're going? So let that be an encouragement to you. Number 2 is this. Patience helps us continue while we wait. Let's look at number 3 and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to Galatians 6. Galatians is several books in front of Hebrews. Galatians 6, this was actually a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to a church in a place called Galatia. It was a church that he had started. And so some error had gotten into the church. And so he's talking with them again about how salvation is not by the law. It's not by works, but it's by the grace of God. It's by what Jesus has done for us. And so as he's closing up the letter in chapter 6, verse 7, he said this. He said, don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Now in the King James it says this, you will always reap what you sow. How many of you ever heard that statement before? You reap what you sow. And usually when we use that statement, it's because somebody's ticked us off, right? Hey, they're just going to reap what they sow. I mean, it's kind of like we're pronouncing judgment on them. But the truth of the matter is it's not just in the negative sense. We get to reap what we sow, in a positive sense too. And not only do we reap what we sow, we reap where we sow. If you want a good marriage, sow into your marriage. If you want a good relationship with your kids, sow into your relationship with your kids. And so he said, you'll always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So let's not get tired. Let me read that again. Let's not get tired of doing what is good. Let's not get tired of doing what is good. Let's not get tired of doing what is good. That may be a word for you today. Maybe you're like, I'm just so tired of just doing the right thing. Well, this is a word for you. Don't get tired of doing what is good. He goes on to say this, at just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. So don't get tired of doing what is good at just the right time. Well, Pastor Rick, when's just the right time? Well, in my life, it's always later than I want it to be. And maybe you've discovered that as well. It's never as soon as I've wanted to be, but it's still the right time. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. So don't get tired. Let me just say this. Don't get tired. Look at the person next to you and say, don't you get tired. Don't you get tired. Tell them that, man. Don't get tired of doing what is good at just the right time. You know what this is really saying? So many times we focus on, well, you're going to reap what you sow. And again, we miss that point even because he's talking about our own lives and that it's not just a negative thing that, if we continue to do what God has called us to do, there's a harvest that comes out of that. But here's the other thing. We miss part of what he's saying. He said, at just the right time. So many times what we have to understand is that the things that God has spoken into our lives are really a part of trusting His timing. Trusting His timing. Man, sometimes it is really hard for me to trust His timing. And one of the reasons I say that is because, just like I said, is a lot of times I think it should be happening and it's nowhere in sight. Or like the pressure on me or the circumstances I'm under, they're just so uncomfortable. And I'm like, now would be a really good time, God, for you to do what you said you were going to do. And it's almost like heaven says, not yet. And I want to go, are you kidding me? But it's just the right time. And so I have to ask myself, do I trust the timing of God? Well, man, Lord, it's taken a long time. Lord, I'm getting older, and Lord, we got this going on, and just I've really got to focus on this right now. Just trust my timing. Just trust my timing. And so part of patience is patience helps us trust God's timing. You remember a few minutes ago when I was talking about the guy named Abraham, that at 75 that God spoke to him and said, hey, look, you and your wife are going to have a baby. And his wife was 65. And I said, 25 years later, when he was 100 and she was 90, that they ended up having the baby. Well, they were human just like us. And sometimes we read these events, these accounts, and we think that just because God used them, that they must be different. They must not struggle like I struggle. And yet they're human just like us. And so Abraham and Sarah, somewhere along the way, that I think they began to be discouraged. And it was like, it wasn't happening. And she kept looking at Abraham and like, dude, you're not getting younger. And then he was like, he probably thought, because he was too smart to say, well, neither are you, but he probably thought that. And as time goes on, and eventually one day, I think they got to a place where it's like, they didn't trust God's timing, and they began to try to fix it themselves and began to try to take care of things themselves. And so Hagar came to him and she said, look, I know God told us this, but maybe there's another way he's supposed to do it. We're both getting old, and here's my handmaid Hagar. Maybe that's the way God wants to do this whole thing. And Abraham goes, okay. And so they ended up having a baby with Hagar, and so his name was Ishmael, which created all sorts of issues in their life, but it really came down to the fact that they'd gotten to a place where they were impatient. It wasn't happening soon enough. Because they didn't trust God's timing, they took things into their own hands and created some unnecessary pain in their lives. I've been that guy where discouragement is huge in my world. I'm dealing with pain that's not healing quick enough. Doors don't seem to be opening. People seem to be unaware that I've trusted. I just feel let down. I mean, just all sorts of things that are going on. It just feels overwhelming. And it's almost like I say to the Lord, okay, I got this. I'm good. I got this. And begin to take things in my own hands and begin to do things that I'm like, I'm pretty sure that on a good day I would know he would not be okay with. And I just create some unnecessary pain in my life. And the truth of the matter is that somewhere along that way I quit trusting his timing. Because surely he would do it now. Surely this is the moment that it would happen. Pastor Rick, when's he going to do it? Just the right time. Just the right time. And you and I don't always know when just the right time is. We think when we're under pressure that pressure means it's just the right time. We think when everything's not going okay that it must be just the right time because I'm really in a struggle right now. I'm really in this battle right now. So right now must be just the right time. But that's not always just the right time. That's why when we trust him, we have to turn over the timing of things to him. And so patience is so important. And again, as the root of the word, the beginning of the word comes from a Latin word which means to suffer or suffering. That there is an element of suffering in patience. Because I hate to wait. And waiting means that thing that's going to make my life different, that thing that's going to put me in a position of what my heart has always longed for, of what God has spoken to me about. Of the thing that he has for me, of his calling on my life, or how to deal with certain situations, or how to respond, or what's going to take place. That until that shows up, that means in the meantime, I'm still dealing with those challenges and struggles that created the discontent in my world in the first place. And it's not that my circumstances have changed. It's that the only thing that I have to lean on for hope and for faith is the promise of God. And over time, if patience isn't a part of it, that suffering can become wearisome. I want to encourage you today. If you become dull or indifferent, your heart's kind of become a little cold, in your walk with God, I want to stir you up and ask you, when's the last time that you really sought Him about His plan for your life? What expectation do you have about the things that He's spoken to you? What is it that your heart burns for, and you don't know how it's going to get there? You don't know how it's going to take place, but you know without a doubt that He's placed that in your heart. When was the last time you had that? And some of you may have quit because you're like, but it's going to happen by now. It's just not been the right time yet. At just the right time. To lean in and trust God's timing again. To take hold of that and to know that, yes, man, we have faith, but also there's this element of patience that comes with it. That in my suffering, I don't let go. I don't loosen my grip. But I hang on to what God has told me. Because I have a confident expectation. So that I'll keep doing what He's called me to do. That's us. That may be you. I want us to bow our heads and close our eyes for just a minute. Let's just spend a moment with God. And I really want us just to take this moment. You just begin to talk to God. And for those of you that you look back and there was a season in your life where you were really leaning into the things of God, you were really talking to Him, and there's just things going on that you're in a season of your life right now where that's not taking place. And there's kind of been this indifference, this dullness that's going on. And you want your heart to burn again for His will, His plan. And look and see where that happened. And there's so many reasons that, they could have gotten distracted by a relationship or just a number of things that could take place. But maybe for you, it just things that He'd spoken to you. It just seemed like they were taking so long. And finally, you're just like, I'm done. That may need to be stirred up again as you grab hold of patience so that you go back to doing the right